John, are you nervous?
No.
Okay. You should be.
Well, I suspect that I've had the dubious privilege of being acquainted with John Hartnett longer than anybody else in this room. I don't know whether you'd call that a privilege or a burden, but I've had it. I first got acquainted with John Hartnett in October 1960, and he and I have been closely associated ever since. I couldn't get rid of him. He was always there. But he and I have been very good friends and business associates. And if you'll notice, I say we have been good friends. John, I hope after I'm through here tonight we are still good friends. But if you're not happy with me, I don't blame you, because I'm going to tell some truths about you. And Irene, I apologize. You're going to learn some things here tonight that you probably never had heard or dreamed of, but they are true. If you haven't already been painted a very vivid picture of John Hartnett, I suggest you read this completely. I think this tells the story. Ralph made some reference here, about his appearance in church. And I think you omitted one thing, Ralph, that I've heard about that. I'm not a member of that church, but I have some friends who are. That in addition to all the things you said about his untidiness and so forth, the report I got was that about 2/3 of the time, his fly was open also. I suggest in that same vein, you read that caution paragraph here in this, then you'll understand it. I think most of you have heard all about John here in Shelbyville. Quite a long trail, John, from Buffalo, New York, to Lexington, Kentucky, to Somerset, Kentucky, and then in God's country here in Shelbyville. You finally made it. When I first got acquainted with John, he was brought here by Dr. Bob Ingram from down Campbellsville, Kentucky, and presented to me as being the incoming manager of the new radio station here. We were together for a day or two, and I thought John walked rather peculiarly, and it seemed constant. Finally, when John wasn't around, I said something to Dr. Bob Ingram. I said, I like your boy that you brought up here, but you got to catch him. You get along or something, doesn't he? He walks peculiarly. Well, Dr. Bob says, don't say anything about that to Bob, or to John. Said, this is the first time he's had any shoes on since he was in Kentucky. Well, I accepted that, but he still walked peculiarly. And after about 2 months, Dr. Bob Ingram was up here again, and I said, Doc, don't you think John still walks rather peculiarly? Look at him going there. He said, yeah, he does. But he said, I thought he'd be accustomed to those shoes by now. Well, finally, Dr. Bob was a chiropractor, and he asked John if he couldn't give him a little treatment or something. He acted like he's having trouble walking. So he had him take off all of his clothes except maybe his trunks. And he discovered nothing wrong with his back, but he still had some of that Kentucky mud caked between his toes. Well, they cleaned that out, and John began to walk better. Most of the stories here tonight have been about John here in Shelbyville. But I've heard a lot of stories about you, John, when you were in Kentucky. And John always said, down in old Kentucky, but you can't hardly tell it. But one of the stories I heard about you, John, was that you and a couple of your Kentucky friends were out late one night in a car in a rather desolate area, and the car broke down. Well, there weren't any houses too close, but they walked to the nearest farmhouse, went up to the door, knocked, told the farmer their problem, asked him if there was someplace they could get a mechanic. He said, no, not this time of night, no chance. said, well, could we stay with you all night? He said, well, I can take 2 of you in the house, but that's the best I can do. He said, the other one of you have to sleep in the barn. Well, one of John's buddies said, okay. Said, I'll sleep in the barn. John, you and your friend here go in the house. Farmer said, now, it won't be too pleasant out there because it's full of cattle, hogs, pigs, and sheep, and goats. He said, you can be comfortable on the hay, but the odor may be a little bit troublesome to you. The guy said, oh, I think I can take it. I'm tired. He went out to the barn. John, his buddy, went in the house. About 30 minutes, somebody knocked on the door. They went to the door, and there was John's buddy. He said, I can't take it any longer. He said, I thought I could, but that odor out there is killing me. There's no way that I can sleep in that barn. Well, the other friend of John said, well, okay. You come on in here, and said, I'll go sleep in the barn. John, of course, stayed in the house. Well, finally, after about 30 minutes, there was another knock on the door. I went to the door, and there was John's other friend. He said, I can't take it. All those animals in there and all that stench, no way. I've got to come in the house. So there was John. It's his turn. Finally, he consented he'd go sleep in the barn. And he did. The other 2 stayed in the house. About 30 minutes, they heard a noise at the door. They went to the door expecting to see John. But no, it was all the animals who come to the house. But after John got to Shelbyville, there was a little culture crept into his life. And one of the things I remember about John more than anything else was he saw his first ballet in Shelbyville. And he went down and watched that a little while, and he saw the girls dancing around there on their toes, you know, and so forth. Finally, he turned around to the guy next to him, and he said, you know something? He said, I think they just get taller girls instead of having that go tiptoe all the time. Well, John, I'm reminded one time about a little boy, and he loafed around a barber shop where there were a lot of adults. He was the only youngster around there. And those adults teased this boy an awful lot. Maybe they roasted him a little. And the boy would become very angry. He'd even try to kick the adults, swear at them, just infuriated him. One day the barber took him aside and said, son, listen, you shouldn't become angry with those people that tease you out there. He said, if they didn't like you, they wouldn't tease you. John, if we didn't love you, we wouldn't roast you.
Thank you, Fred. Move right on now to member of the clergy. It's hard to say what somebody at this level is going to have to say about John Hartnett. Reverend Jim Horner. Jim?
Thank you.
We're going to have some devotions after all that, John. This is the first time I've ever been asked in my career to preach a roast. I don't know exactly what to do. However, they stole my thunder. The sheriff came in here with this poster, and I was going to talk about this picture. They took down a picture that was taken up at the church. That's true. This is a directory picture for the church, only it's right after Father Mong asked for pledges from the people. I met John in the west part of our church for the first time, and I thought, what kind of a guy is this going to run a radio station? Because he came in and he told me, he said, you're Mr. Horner? I said, yes. And he said, well, I'm John Hartnett from the radio station. And somehow or another, we got on to talking about cigarettes, and John said, well, I've quit smoking. And I said, well, I have too. And just about that time, our janitor walked in, and he had a pack of Lucky Strikes in his pocket, and we both attacked him and took a cigarette. So I knew he was my kind of a guy. Well, he had some interesting neighbors and some things that happened, and I couldn't help it, Jack, when you talked. That must have been the ball game I listened to that night when you folks, because I heard some dandy reports on the scores. I listened to you, John. I really did. I was a tremendous fan of yours, really a fan. Ralph, I want to tell you too. I've got some used clothing down at the church. If things are still on a downturn for you. We had a program, or the radio station had a program, sometime way back there was something like, I think Lenny's Pastry Shop sponsored it, and it was when you announced all the babies. And the theme, can you remember the theme? Turaluralua. And it was funny because right after that program, I was supposed to go on once a week. We sang, you got me to sing some hymns, and we had a request hymn program. Well, I always got there on time. But they would start in the control room and just be about 2 minutes before, and someone would say, look out the window, see if you see him coming down over the hill. And that thing would be going, somebody would open the door and somebody would grab his coat, he'd throw it like he does, and away he'd go. Someone would hand him something else, he'd sit down and talk, and then he'd come on with that sweet voice like he'd been there all morning. That was great. I really enjoyed that. So that's how I got acquainted with John. And I had somebody else that got acquainted with John, only it was down. Do you remember Ben Mattingly's tire store? Oh, yeah. That was down in Somerset, Kentucky. And one of your old neighbors that lived over there on Van Avenue with you, that's the first time he met you, was down in Ben Mattingly's tire store in Somerset, Kentucky. John was having his snow tires taken off the front end of his car. Kentucky Tornado. Some of the ladies had to think about that a while, John, before they knew what was really happening. There's so many things we could talk about here, but this one, I liked. One night John told me, we were just talking about one friend, and he's dead now, but he was the greatest. Those of you who remember Marvin Young, would you hold up your hands? Remember Marvin Young? Marvin Young was a real nice guy, and I'm sure that all of those who worked at the station knew Marvin. He's the most unforgettable character I ever met, because if you ask Marvin Young, what time is it? Marvin had one move. It wasn't exactly slow, but it was medium slow. And he'd look at his watch and he'd say, it's 9:26:32. And he did the 10 o'clock news. And the 10 o'clock news was beautiful. I listened to it a lot of times, but I didn't hear it this time. And John and I were talking about Marvin, and how much we thought about him, and how much he was really a craftsman. And he kept the radio station on the air a lot of times that nobody else could. But John said you never knew what was going to happen. And I remember this because you and I shared it together and just laughed like hyenas. Marvin was doing the 10 o'clock news, and all of a sudden, nothing. Everything just went dead. And you were listening at home, and of course, a minute on the radio is like an hour anyway, and it went 2, 3 minutes, and Marvin. So John jumps in the car and shoots out the radio station as fast as he can. He runs into the control room there, and Marvin's back on the air by then. As soon as he had a break, he said, Marvin, what in the world happened? Marvin said, I swallowed a fly. That's great. That's the best. But practice makes perfect in everything except getting up in the morning for John Hartnett. And he just has so many moves that it's unbelievable. When he moved in up there by Morris Finkel, he thought maybe he would raise some trees, some fruit trees. And he put out a fruit tree one year, and he gave a couple of dollars for it, and the frost came and just killed it. So he wasn't about to be deterred in his effort to raise fruit in his own yard, so he bought another tree. Only this time, instead of planting it in the yard, he planted it in a box. And when it got cold outside, he'd wheel that box. He had it on kind of a cart. He'd wheel that box in the garage. Well, Queenie stayed in the garage, too. So, no, he didn't do it. Queenie didn't do what you thought she did. But he was wheeling that tree out one day, and at the same time he gave Queenie a drink in her pan outside on the driveway, and he wheeled that tree out. And Morris Finkel looked down the street when all this was happening, and he said, holy mackerel, he said, he's the only man I know who walks his tree and waters his dog.